Once in Tula, the incredible saga of a simple rifle that conquered the world. Picture the era, not today's world, with its smart gadgets and fleeting trends. Picture the Soviet Union in the early 30s, a country that was just picking itself up off its knees after wars and revolution. A nation looking toward the future with iron resolve. The air was thick with the spirit of industrialization, steam, and metal. And in that air, at one of the oldest arms plants in Tula, something more than just a product was born. A symbol was born, an icon, a legend. Its name was the TOZ-8. To me, this rifle isn't just a piece of wood and metal. It's a portal to the past. When I hold it, I feel the warmth from the hands of the millions who held it before me. Young pioneers, grim fur trappers holding their breath in the winter taiga, athletes whose gaze was fixed only on the bullseye. This is the everyman's rifle, the weapon that was the first step into a bigger world for generations. And you know what's the most amazing thing? Even people completely disconnected from guns, those who can't tell an AR from shotgun, when they hear the words single shot .22, they picture this one. That one, with the long barrel, lacquered wooden stock, and that distinctive bolt click. Why? Because the TOZ-8 was, in the truest sense, a people's champion. It was produced in such vast quantities that it became part of the cultural fabric of an entire nation. Officially, though, it wasn't just a plinker. It was given a serious military index, GRU 56V834. That decodes to 5.6mm small bore, sporting rifle TOZ-8. Sounds more substantial, right? Being adopted into service, even as a training weapon, is a sign of high trust. The state was saying, yes, this civilian rifle is worthy of training our future soldiers and defenders of the motherland. The Wizard of Tula, Dmitri Kochav. Behind every great object is a great man. Behind the TOZ-8 stands a truly titanic figure, Dmitri Mihailovich Kochav. If gunsmithing were a religion, Kochav would be one of its saints. Imagine the year 1920, a young Soviet republic, widespread devastation. And at this time, in Tula, at the heart of it all, the Tula arms plant, they create a hunting workshop. And it's headed by none other than Kochav. He was a strategist. He looked far ahead. He understood that the country needed not just combat weapons for the army, but also accessible, reliable, cheap weapons for the masses. For training, for sport, for livelihood. He gave a green light to the development of small-bore rifles, which were just beginning their journey. The first Swallow was the TOZ-1, created by Selivanov and Kanevsky, who essentially did a creative reinterpretation of the German Gecko. But that was just the prologue. The genuine masterpiece, the hit that the whole country and beyond would listen to, was created by Kochav himself. His TOZ-8 is the epitome of brilliant simplicity. He didn't reinvent the wheel. He took the best ideas and refined them to perfection, to a level of polish and manufacturability that allowed the rifle to remain in production for nearly 50 years. Think about that. A rifle that saw the light of day in the early 30s was still being produced straight through to the 80s. That's phenomenal. It survived a terrible war, the country's reconstruction, the space race, and stagnation. And all that time, it remained in demand. What's more, it was exported under the famous Baikal brand, which in Soviet times was the single face of all civilian arms exports from the USSR. It was only in the turbulent 90s that the Izhevsk mechanical plant grabbed this brand for itself. But the soul of Baikal was undoubtedly Tula, and its heart for many years was our humble heroine, the figure 8. The philosophy of brilliant simplicity, what was it for? Let's ask a simple question. What was actually required of this rifle? What was the state order handed down from the top to Kochav and his team? The requirements were ironclad and brooked no compromise. Simplicity. Any teenager in an OSOVIK Chayam club, the forerunner of Dosov, had to be able to assemble and disassemble the rifle after a 15-minute briefing. Manufacturability and low cost. It had to be practically stamped out on an assembly line with minimal expense. The country was poor, but military patriotic education and reserve training were a priority. Reliability. It had to work in any condition, in the dust of a shooting range, in the rain on a training ground, in 40 below zero cold in the Siberian taiga. A malfunction was an unaffordable luxury. Versatility. One tool, many tasks. It had to train future soldiers, be used by competing athletes, and put food on the table for fur trappers. And you know what? Kochav nailed every point brilliantly. The design was genius in its simplicity. The single-shot scheme, meaning after every shot you had to manually work the bolt, eject the casing, and load a new round. Seems like a disadvantage, right? But no, it was a huge plus for training. It taught patience, focus, and the value of every single shot. You couldn't just spray bullets. You had to aim carefully, squeeze the trigger smoothly, and only then, after processing the result, reload. It was a school of mastery. The bolt action couldn't be simpler. A sturdy receiver. And the weight. 3 and 1200 kilograms. For a trapper covering dozens of kilometers through the taiga in a day, this was, of course, a bit much. A tad heavy, they'd say. But the rifle's main task was accomplished with flying colors. It was a workhorse, not a racehorse. Economic brief. Why the TOZ-8 was a miracle of Soviet industry. Let's step away from the iron and wood for a minute and look at the situation from an economic perspective. I've dug through some archival data and analyses, and here's the picture that emerges. The USSR of the late 20s and early 30s was a country undergoing forced industrialization. Money was desperately short. All resources were thrown into heavy industry and the military-industrial complex. And in these conditions, finding the funds and capacity for the mass production of civilian weapons was a real challenge. But the party and the government were shrewd. They understood that an investment in the .22 wasn't an expense, but an investment. An investment in the future. Preparation of mobilization reserves. Training millions of young men to shoot on cheap TOZ-8s was many times more effective and cheaper than doing it straight away on military Mosin rifles. A soldier arriving in the army already with basic shooting skills became a valuable fighter much faster. Import substitution and export. The USSR didn't want to depend on imports, even for sporting goods. The TOZ-8 met that need domestically. Later, with export shipments under the Baikal brand, it even started to bring in much-needed foreign currency for the country. Imagine how many thousands of these rifles went to Eastern Bloc countries and even some capitalist states. Economies of scale. The more rifles produced, the lower the unit cost. Refined technology, parts commonality, assembly line production. All this made the TOZ-8 incredibly cheap to manufacture. By some estimates, by the 70s, its cost to the state was symbolic. It's like the Lada car. For all its flaws, its accessibility for the average family was a strategic achievement. Supporting the fur trade. The harvesting of furs was a significant source of Soviet export revenue. A hunter armed with a reliable and accurate small bore, the .22 long rifle cartridge didn't ruin the pelts, was more efficient. The state was essentially giving him a tool to increase his productivity. Thus, the TOZ-8 wasn't just a rifle. It was a cog in a giant state machine, a small but very important element of a system working for the defense, economy, and ideology of a vast country. Evolution of a legend. How the figure 8 learned and changed. The figure 8 wasn't static. It lived, evolved, and adapted to new demands. It's like a success story where the main character constantly levels up his skills. For sport, the basic rifle was good for initial training, but top-tier athletes needed something more. And for them, the figure 8 began to be improved. The standard sight, an open, adjustable sight marked out to a wildly optimistic 250 meters, was replaced with complex, fully adjustable diopter sights like the legendary Istrebital Destroyer. This allowed shooters to squeeze every bit of available accuracy out of the rifle. The trigger mechanism was laughably simple. There was practically nothing to adjust in it. But this spawned a wave of folk artistry. Master gunsmiths and enthusiastic shooters would take out their files and sandpaper and polish the trigger to a hair's breadth. It would become incredibly smooth and light, which immediately improved grouping. This was a form of tuning the Soviet version of customization. Post-war revival and specialization. The war was a terrible test. But the most astonishing thing, the figure 8 managed to see action on the other side of the front. Captured TOZ-8s were adopted by the Wehrmacht under the dry official designation Kleinkaliberger 205R, where they are stood for Russisch. The Germans, who valued reliability and simplicity, had no qualms about using our humble training tool. After victory, the rifle's life continued. Taking into account the old complaints from hunters about the weight, a lightweight version was created for them, the TOZ-11, a mere 2 kilograms. But it wasn't widely produced, being replaced by a more serious modernization, the TOZ-16. For sports, the TOZ-12 was built on the figure 8 base. And this is where the most interesting and sometimes convoluted history begins, the history of modifications. The Tula plant loved, oh how it loved, to create new indexes for what seemed like trivial changes. Post-war, TOZ-8M rifles received a modified stock, bolt, and sight. Then came the TOZ-801 and TOZ-802. What was the difference? You won't believe it. The material of the butt plate. One had plastic, the other had rubber. That's it. A new modification was born. It's like being given 2 identical cars, but with different tires, and calling them different models. On one hand, it's bureaucracy. On the other, it's attention to detail, however small. But the figure 8 also had real hidden potential. Back in the 30s, a magazine-fed rifle, the TOZ-9, was created based on it. The genius of the solution was that a 4-round magazine assembly simply took the place of a single-shot adapter insert. The receiver remained almost unchanged. This is the pinnacle of design thought, when one basic platform allows for different products without a root and branch overhaul of production. The mystery of the barrel, 6 versus 4. One of the coolest technical detective stories involves the rifling in a barrel. From the start until the 70s, the figure 8 had a barrel with 4 grooves and a twist rate of 350 millimeters. But in 1977, almost at the end of its career, the rifle underwent a serious upgrade. The plant switched to 6 grooves with a slower twist rate, 420 millimeters. Why? It's all brilliantly simple. Bullet centering. 6 grooves more reliably centered the bullet in the bore before it took off. Imagine you're not just pushing a ball down a pipe, but carefully fitting it into a hexagonal socket. This improved accuracy. Fighting skidding. High-velocity .22 LR ammo had appeared in the world. The old 4 grooves sometimes couldn't grip such a bullet fast enough, and it would start to skid inside the barrel before properly engaging the rifling, like a car on ice. This destroyed accuracy. The slower 6-groove twist solved the problem. And here, one of the most persistent myths about the TOZ-8 was born: don't shoot imported ammo in it. It's too powerful for our rifle. In reality, it wasn't about the strength of the action, it had strength to spare, but precisely about the rifling geometry. And by imported, they mostly meant ammo from East Germany, GDR, which was indeed snappier. The Finnish Lapua, the gold standard, was only available to select athletes who had long since moved on from the figure 8. Amusingly, at the same time, the TOZ-16, the little sister, continued for several more years to be produced with the old 4-groove barrels. A typical Soviet practice, using up old stock so nothing went to waste. Somewhere in a warehouse, there were crates of those barrels, and they had to be used up. The curse of the don't lose it string, a genius flaw that became legendary. And now we come to the spiciest, most mysterious, and I'd say the most soulful part of this whole story. The thing that bonded every owner of the figure 8 and created a sense of brotherhood. A design flaw. A real one. I'm talking about the rear receiver cover. That little part that closes the back of the bolt. Well, in the basic TOZ-8 design, it wasn't secured in any way. It just slid into a groove. And in the woods, while walking through thick undergrowth with an awkward movement, it had a habit of falling out. Just like that. And right behind it, now without its rear support, the bolt itself would fall out. Losing the bolt is like losing your car keys. The rifle turned into a useless stick. And what did our resourceful shooters do? They performed miracles of folk invention. They would tie a sturdy piece of string to the bolt handle, attaching the other into the stock or just wrapping it around their wrist. This don't lose it string became the hallmark of a seasoned trapper or just a careful owner. You saw a rifle with a string on the bolt. You knew the owner had been burned before and knew the score. And now, pay attention, the million-dollar question that keeps me up at night. A mystery more intriguing than any detective novel. Why was this flaw never fixed? Because a solution existed. It did. Back in the 30s, the magazine-fed TOZ-9 had a cover with a retaining screw. That cover was 100% insured against loss. But this solution was never carried over to the mass-produced TOZ-8. Never. Right up until the end of production in the 80s, people were receiving new rifles with this hole leading to nowhere. Why? I can only speculate. Too expensive? Unlikely. One tiny screw for millions of rifles is pennies. Too complicated? Also no. So, there must have been a reason. Perhaps the higher-ups believed a shooter should always be attentive and collected. That this wasn't a flaw, but a pedagogical tool. A kind of harsh lesson. Lose your bolt. Your own fault. You'll be more careful next time. The price of a mistake is several days of downtime and shame in front of your comrades while you source a new part. Harsh. Yes. Very Soviet? Absolutely. This little shortcoming speaks volumes. About the priorities of a giant industrial machine. About its conservatism. And about the people's wisdom, which always finds a way to work around the system. Epilogue. The immortal classic. Today, the TOZ-8 is history. It's been discontinued, but it's alive. It lives on in collections, in gun safes, on the walls of village houses. People still use it because, frankly, there's nothing in it to break. Its ammunition is still some of the most affordable in the world. It became a symbol of an era when things were built not for one season, but for decades. When simplicity and reliability were valued more than fancy features and complexity. When objects had a soul. When I hold a TOZ-8, I'm not holding a rifle. I'm holding a history textbook, an economics manual, a philosophical treatise on simplicity and genius. I'm holding the legacy of a great designer, Kochav, and the labor of millions of Tula workers. I'm holding a piece of my country's history. And you know, I'm sure that as long as at least one figure 8 sits quietly in someone's closet, passed down from father to son, the story of this legend isn't over. It's just waiting for its time to once again click its signature bolt and send a bullet right on target. Well, that wraps up our saga about the Tula legend. But this is just the beginning of our conversation. Now it's your turn. Chime in down in the comments. Did you ever have an encounter with a TOZ-8? Maybe your grandpa had one stashed in the attic? Or you shot one yourself at a range? Share your story. Let's build a huge community archive of memories about this amazing rifle right here. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This story is just the start. We've got so many more legends, secrets, and detective investigations from the world of guns and history coming up. Smash that like button if you enjoyed this. Share this story with your friends. Let's discuss it all together. Your feedback is the fuel for our next meetups. Thanks for being with me today. Till the next story.